Welcome to ADF Insider about ADF Security. My name is Frank Nymphius and I'm from the Oracle JDeveloper and ADF Product Management team. In this session, I will talk about security in general and ADF Security in particular. I will introduce the relationship between the Oracle Platform Security Service and ADF Security and provide an architectural overview of how the two work together. I will cover the design time facilities that we have in Oracle JDeveloper to create ADF Security protected ADF applications, and then talk about security best practices in ADF. So let's start with the security risks. Usually developers seek for guidance of what to look for and what to implement in their applications. And in security, the guidance that is provided either comes from security consultants, advisory boards, or in this case the OWASP website. OWASP is an open web application security project that every year releases the top 10 security risks as they experience it throughout the year on their website for everyone to have a read up and then check their own application if they're at a risk. Not in a particular order, I listed the top 10 of 2010, so this includes SQL injection, basically the non-filtered user input that goes straight to the database and then would execute a SQL expression that returns information that you normally don't want to share with any user. Cross-site scripting, the ability to invoke scripts on a local client. Authentication and session management that might not work properly. Insecure redirects, so if you're directing from one application to another one, and if that requires a decent set of security, then you need to make sure that your security infrastructure is not broken by a redirect. So you have to make sure that the redirect is correct, so not passing a token and then have the called application considering that token as a valid authentication. Security misconfigurations, of course, if you misconfigure your security infrastructure, then security will not apply to the application. If you have a failure to restrict URL access, that also may allow people to jump in. The example I can give here is for Java server faces. If you're in unbounded task flow in ADF or in the normal faces config scenario in the Java server faces land, then any page actually can be directly accessed. So there's no way out of the box that will force users to go through a specific path to hit a specific page. So you want to protect this. You want to guide the user so that the user will follow your business case in the application and not directly jump to a page. And then unvalidated redirects and forwards. So these are the top 10. There's a lot more to consider. But anyway, this is a type of guidance that you can go to their website, just read up on that, and then check your applications if they're at a risk or if they're okay. In addition to that, there are design patterns. The typical design patterns we find in security are defense in depth. Now this is also known as the multi-layer security. Least privileged access, so even if you're the administrator of the database, when you run through a specific applications, you shouldn't be the database administrator, because if someone hacks into your account, then he will get more privileges than he would need or you want him to have. Single access point, now that is if your application requires users to enter on a specific page, make sure that you force them to go there. This could be before authentication or after authentication. So nobody, for instance, should be able to access a protected page without being authenticated. On the same side, you can say that once a user is authenticated, you want to have him starting exactly at that page. Roles, now these are either user groups where you can define privileges for a specific group of people, or this could be application roles where the responsibility within an application is protected by a role and then a permission is granted to that. There's a full view with arrow design pattern. Now that means that if you're an administrator or if you're a customer support member, then maybe you need to see more exceptions or more exception details than the average user. For the average user, it might be okay to just know that there's a breakage in the current functionality of the application. They should call support, but then for you, you want to see the full stack trace. You don't want to expose stack trace to everyone, because stack trace contain a lot of information about the software that you use on the server side, and then any knowledgeable hacker would make sense out of that and know what software you have and maybe dig up what the problems are with that software reported in the past. The Oracle Platform Security Services, or OPSS in short, is an architectural layer within Oracle Fusion middleware. It's a set of APIs that allow clients like Oracle ADF to authenticate and authorize users for a specific page or resource that is protected. ADF applications don't perform authentication itself, and they don't perform authorization itself. All they do is they issue requests for authentication and requests for authorization. And this is what we do through the ADF Security context, and the ADF Security context is established through the configuration of ADF Security on an ADF application. OPSS delegates authentication, in the case of a WebLogic server being used, to authentication providers, and these authentication providers then redirect that request to an identity management system. And that could be an LDAP server, that could be the database, or anything else that you configure on WebLogic server to perform user authentication. Similar authorization is controlled by a policy store, and that policy store by default is a file-based store, but can also be configured to be LDAP or the database server. On this slide we see two architecture diagrams. On the left hand side we see the design time integration of OPSS and ADF Security. On the right hand side we see the runtime version of the same. On the left side, at design time, you see that the green boxes that represent the identity management belong to the JSON data XML file in your current project. What we don't do in Oracle JDevOps is we're not hooking up directly to an identity management system, and instead we allow you to simulate the runtime environment in that you can create test users and test groups, and then you grant permissions to access a specific set of protectable resources to those test users. The web XML file is configured with an authentication servlet. As ADF is not doing any sort of authentication or authorization itself, as soon as we recognize there's a request for an authorized resource or a resource that requires authorization, we redirect to the authentication servlet if the user is not authenticated, just for the WebLogic server through OPSS to authenticate the user. And as soon as the user is authenticated, or if the server immediately returns a response that the user is authenticated, then the servlet will make sure that the work continues where you actually wanted to navigate to. At runtime in WebLogic server, in this case, when you go with the default configuration of Oracle Fusion Middleware, the default policy store is represented by a file called system.jsondata.xml. And from the XML metadata, it's exactly the same as a JSON.data.xml file, except that the system.jsondata.xml file doesn't contain user groups and users. But what it does is it will allow you to map users and user groups to application roles. For the authentication and the knowledge about what is the group membership of a specific user, at runtime, OPSS always delegates to an identity management store. And we see a list of authentication providers that ship with the product. You can use RDBMS, you can use the Oracle Internet Directory, Oracle Virtual Directory, you can use LDAP, Active Directory, or you can even write your own JAS login module if you need to authenticate to something that is not yet provided as an authentication provider. Once the user is authenticated, because of its user name or the enterprise role membership, which is nothing else than an enterprise group or a user group, the user is part of an application role, and the application role is specific to the application that you run. So if there's an application role called application role 1, and this application role exists in two different ADF applications, then there's no conflict in the grants. So if you grant user 1 access to application role 1, and then in the second application you have user 2 access to application role 1, then these two users only have the privilege within their particular application they are in. It's not a kind of a global permission that you set there. So application role is just a mean of making configuration easier, because if you try to grant thousands of permissions to every individual user, then that's not scalable and that's not easy to manage either. So you use the abstraction of user groups or enterprise roles, and then have enterprise roles mapped to application roles, and then application roles in your application will have JAS permissions, and this relays JAS permission grants to a specific object. So this by default could be pages and task flows, or even more logically protection, a menu structure. Every permission is identified by a target, by a permission class, and by an action. The permission classes in JAS normally you will have to create it yourself, but in ADF Security there are 3 permission classes that already exist. I will introduce them later. A target describes the object. A page, for instance, identified by page name. A task flow is identified by a task flow name, ID, and a location. And then you have the action that you want to protect. Typical action is access, or as we put it, the view of it. But an action could also be like update, delete. And this is all checked through OPS as using JAS. As soon as you enable ADF Security, I mentioned that the web XML file will be updated with a servlet, the authentication servlet. You see the example of the authentication servlet configuration on the slides. But then there's another file that gets changed, and this is the ADF config.xml file. It's the ADF configuration file, and this file contains an authorization enforce flag and an authentication require flag. If both are set to true, then that means that your application enforces authentication and authorization. You can also set authorization enforced to false and authentication required to true, in which case we only look for authentication but never try to authorize any resource access. While I show you the XML on this slide, you never need to directly edit the XML, because as we will see later, this is all nicely wrapped in a Visual Design Time environment in Oracle JDeveloper. Another file that gets updated is the WebLogic server XML file, so the WebLogic.xml file, and this is updated with a lifecycle listener, an ADF application lifecycle listener, and this you can use to configure how upon deployment you want to have policies defined locally in your JSON data XML file to be broadcasted or deployed to the server. So imagine that you already have a deployed application, and then you want to redeploy the application because you determine changes on the application, but then you have policies within the JSON data XML file of the redeployed application. Now you may either decide to merge existing policies on the server with the policies defined in the JSON data XML file, or maybe replace it. Read up the documentation on what the options are for that servlet and for that lifecycle listener. It's just on this session we're not going any deeper than that, just other than pointing out that these settings exist. To explain the design time environment that we have in Oracle JDeveloper for ADF Security and how you protect ADF applications, let's go by an example. What you see here is a screenshot of Oracle JDeveloper 11G Release 2, and you see a blank page just with some tab panels on it and a welcome message. And this application right now is in unprotected mode. What I added to this application are 3 regions, and one of the regions is calling an additional task flow. So what we wanted to do is we want to protect the application itself, so we want to enforce that user need to authenticate, but then we have different regions with different functionality, all bound to ADF business components as the business service. And one of the task flows that you can see coming from a component palette is a task flow deployed in an ADF library. So the sources of this task flow are not part of the actual application design. Instead, there's a library configured on the application that allows you to reach out to that task flow at runtime. Still, this task flow needs to be protected in the same context of the whole application. To configure ADF Security, you go in JDeveloper onto the application menu, or on the application navigator you see this little window icon on the right side of the name of the application. When you press this, you get this menu structure here, and here you choose the secure option, and this opens a sub menu with the various options that you can use to configure ADF Security within Oracle IDF and JDeveloper. The first option, configure ADF Security, Now this is the basic wizard that you start and that you run to enable security on an Oracle JDeveloper instance. Application roles, as I mentioned before, are specific groups of permissions that you want to apply or grant to a specific enterprise group, enterprise rule, or user. And then you have users and groups. Now this allows you to create test users and test groups, simulating the identity management system and environment that you have available at runtime. Resource grants, now this is actually where you grant privileges or permissions, access permissions, to a user or a group for a specific protected resource. Now this protected resource could be a page, could be a task flow, but as mentioned could also be a menu option. Then there are entitlement grants. Now entitlement grants, they don't have anything to do with Oracle Entitlement Server. What they do is they simplify administration of your application in that they allow you to group resources to one single grant. You can easily imagine that if you have a set of users that all require the same permissions for different resources, that the amount of configuration and the amount of administration to get this security right is immense. So instead you can simplify the task by defining an entitlement, and this entitlement you associate different resources. They all need the same protection so that you have one grant statement. And also, when we talked about in the beginning about the OWASP top 10 security misconfiguration was one of the issues that they found. Now, the more complex your security configuration is, the more likely is that you have an error in there. So using entitlement grants is an easy way to simplify configuration. And then you have another option to configure security deployment. For the security deployment, if you deploy to a production system, credentials cannot be deployed, so you have to take them out of the EF file deployment. So if you go to the configure security deployment, then it allows you to configure the EF file, and you can say, okay, don't try to deploy the test users and the test roles, because this is not what is allowed. The application roles will be deployed, but not the user groups and the users. So for the sample application that I built, what I want to implement and that I want to use as a guidance through ADF Security is I want to implement that everybody, anonymous users and authenticated users, can access the home page. I want to have a single point of application entry. That means you shouldn't be allowed to directly go to a specific page within a task flow. Authenticated users can see their profile. If you're not authenticated, then there's no way to get to the profile tab. Only managers should be able to see the manager salary tab. Employees and managers can search for employees, but only managers can update the reporting employee data, whereas HR managers, a more privileged type of managers, can update all employee data. And then there is a managers only tab that is accessible to managers only, and it can be selected and used only by HR managers. So this is the policies that I want to implement for my little sample application. So let's have a look at this sample. Initially, when I introduced the sample application, I talked about 4 regions. Now these regions are all placed into one of these grayed out panel tabs. Currently I'm not authenticated in this application, which means that I have no access at all beside of the home page. So I do have a user profile, and this user profile contains a region. I have a management salary overview that also has a region, and then the employee search consists of 2 regions, one of which I take out of an ADF library. So let's have a look for one of the privileged users so that we can experience the policies that are implemented through ADF Security. So I'm logging in, and again ADF Security doesn't perform the login itself, it delegates logging to the WebLogic server. So one of the more privileged users is a UNOD. So after the authentication, a redirect is performed, and now for IUNOD I see that IUNOD can access the user profile tab, the management salary overview tab, and the employee search tab, but it cannot access the HR manager only tab, though he is a manager, which will entitle him to at least see that there is a tab for HR managers, which, as we will see later, the employees view cannot see. So the policies that I wanted to implement is that all users can access the home page. Now this is what I already showed in the unauthenticated phase. I have a single point of application entry, which you can't see by this application because it doesn't really transparently show that. But once you're authenticated, there's a way in ADF Security to precisely tell it where you want to have the redirect to happen to. Now only managers can see the Manage Salary tab. So we can see the Manage Salary tab. So I click on that, and this gives me this overview of management salary being paid. So this is what managers can see, and IUnode is defined as a manager, so IUnode can see that option. Only managers can update a salary. So let's have a look. If I go to the user profile tab here, then Alexander Unold, who is the authenticated user, that is enforced through Groovy in the application module, or more precisely in a view criteria that we apply to one of the view objects. And what we can see is that IUnode can select an employee and then edit the selected employee data. And what we see is that obviously IUnode doesn't have the permission to edit the employee salary. So he's allowed obviously to see the salary, but not yet to update the salary. So, but that is something that the HR manager should be able to doing. So let's go to the employee search, and here we have an advanced search, and the result of the search is displayed in a region, and in the region I can navigate. So if we search for a specific employee, so let's go by department, say IT, search for that, then select an employee, and we can now step through the employee data, and again we cannot edit the salary. So this area here already is about the task flow, so the ability to navigate off to an edit selected employee record is part of a remote task flow that we incorporate into this panel tab. So let's log out. A normal employee account is Daniel Favier, and let's log in here. So first we see, like the not authenticated user, we are lacking the HR manager tab, but also we cannot get access to the management salary overview. We do have a user profile, but as there is no employee reporting to Mr. Favier, there's no choice that you can make here to edit a selected employee. And there is the employee search tab. So if I search for everyone in the department table, you see this button of edit selected employee is disabled, so I cannot edit with this account any employee in the table. So this is all enforced through ADF Security. As I mentioned on the slides, and we'll have more slides coming up, we protect out of the box the pages and the task flows. We're not directly protecting through the framework automatically tabs, buttons. Now this is what you would use expression language for. This is where we provide you a declarative development environment to check permissions without needing to understand what JAWS is all about. So last but not least, let's log in as an HR manager. So that's Stephen King, and now we see the HR managers only tab being enabled. If I click that, I can see the content of it, and also I can go to the user profile tab, edit a selected employee, and what you see is that now I can set the salary, because Stephen King is in a different role than Alexander Unold was, and for that reason he has the permission to update the salary. Security in this case, though it's not really something very visible on the screen, is something that you can implement on 3 layers. You can implement that on the business service layer, you can implement that on the controller layer and the binding layer, and you can set this up on the view layer. On the view layer you would use expression language. On the controller layer, I could use a router activity that uses the same expression language to determine if a specific navigation is allowed for the current authenticated user. In this case, I put security on the entity level. So on an attribute, I defined that a specific permission to be needed, or a specific role membership to be needed to update the salary. And then the framework automatically will render this field as read-only if you don't have the correct permissions. On the view layer, I use expression language on these tabs to either render or render as disabled, dependent on the privileges, or in this case, render as enabled throughout the panel tabs. In another demo, I will show you how you implement exactly that security scenario. Let's rehearse the security design patterns I showed before. So if we wanted to use this as a guidance just to make sure that our application is protected, then we need to be aware of, now, what do we have in store in ADF to use one of these patterns and implement these in our application. First thing, page authorization. Page authorization in ADF is required for any page that sits in the unbounded task flow. When you enable ADF Security, then by default, pages in an unbounded task flow are not accessible. So you will have to grant a permission. Now this is good, because another pattern I didn't list is the safe default. So once ADF Security is enabled, and if you don't tell us otherwise, we just lock down the whole system. To make pages accessible, you need to visually and declaratively in Oracle JDeveloper grant permission to this page for an application role. And you do this in the resource grant option that I showed on another slide. And then what happens is JSON data XML file gets updated with a class called region permission, and this has an action defined as view, which also means accessible, and then the target of the page is a fully qualified path of its page def file. Now what ADF Security is doing is it's protecting pages through their binding file, which means that if there is a JSF page that doesn't have a binding, ADF Security cannot be used to protect it. If there is a page that doesn't use ADF bindings but you want to protect it, what you can do is you can create an empty page definition file, and then ADF Security will take care of this as well. Now this is for page protection. Pages that reside in a bounded task flow don't need to have extra protection defined. They are immediately and automatically protected by the security policy that is applied on the task flow. Now this means if you're allowed to access a task flow, then you're allowed to access any of the pages within the task flow. Similar to the page security, task flows are protected by default. So when you enable ADF Security, task flows are inaccessible. To make a task flow accessible for an authenticated user, you apply a permission or grant a permission to a security role, to an application role, and this application role then somehow matches to the user, and so the user can access the task flow. The permission class being used is task flow permission, and again you don't have to remember that, it's just like done for you through Oracle JDeveloper. The action is view, and the target, what defines the task flow to protect, is the fully qualified path of the task flow, including the task flow document name, so the XML name, and the ID of the task flow. And this fully qualified path starts with the webinf directory. The two, page definition and task flow security, are handled automatically for you by ADF Security. But this doesn't mean that that is all that you can use ADF Security for. Every permission that you define by default is a JAS permission, and nothing prevents you from using Java expressions, or as we will see later, Groovy, to check a specific permission for whatever reason you need the check. ADF Security provides expression language vocabulary, so-called global security expressions, that you can use anywhere in an application, as far as on the view controller side, to check the user authentication state, the username, the role memberships, or the permission that this user has to access a specific protected resource. you see there's an expression called region viewable. Now that means, am I allowed to access a specific page? And again, a page that resides in a task flow doesn't need to be security checked. On the same, you can ask, am I allowed, or the authenticated user, is the user allowed to access a task flow? And then you use the expression security context dot task flow viewable, and you provide the target. And the target, as I mentioned, starting from a web-inf directory, the fully qualified path, including the document name and the task flow ID. The expression builder in Oracle JDeveloper gives you access to these expressions through the ADF binding node, as you can see on the screenshot. Under this, there's a security context, and this all lists the expressions that you have available. So you can declaratively assign expression strings. The expression builder screenshot shows an area called description, and this description area gives you detailed information about how to use an expression. By default, it's collapsed. This is why I mentioned this. You need to click on that node so it unfolds, and then you can read how a specific expression needs to be used. One thing I want to point out on this slide as well is you see that there is two security context expressions that check for granted resource and granted permission. This allows you to directly check a permission either against a physical permission class, so say that for legacy reasons you already have existing Java EE applications, so you have existing permission classes that you created in the past, and for simplicity you want to use the same permission classes within Oracle ADF, or you have resource permissions created to protect menu items or command buttons, any kind of logical functionality that you want to protect, then you can check against this permission. On the business service side, the best integration with ADF Security is what we have with ADF Business Components. The integration is through the ADF Security context, declaratively through security that you can configure on an ADF Business Components entity, and through Groovy. Groovy is a scripting language that allows you to substitute a Java access to a method by a dot notation. In this screenshot, what we do have here is an example of how you can restrict a query to return only the data that are allowed for the user to see. So in our sample application, when a user clicks the profile tab, we want to make sure that this user only sees his or her own data and not the data of anyone else. To do this, we apply a view criteria, which is a named where clause, to the view object, and have this view criteria using a bind variable. And this bind variable points to ADF context, security context, username. So from the authenticated user, I read in the name and put this to my where clause. And as a result, if that matches with data in the database, then the view object will only return these data, and you can't work around that. When you protect entities, then you can protect this from delete, from update. But one thing you have to do first is you have to tell the system which of your entities requires authorization checking. Unlike on the web layer, in the view controller, and on the web layer, what we don't do with entities is we're not protecting them by default. So instead we reverse the model and first require you to use the edit security option on an entity to enable security for a specific action. Either that could be update, delete, and security can be applied on the entity as a whole, as you can see on the right side of the screenshot. So in general, you can say an entity is updatable for a specific user or requires a specific permission to be updatable. If you don't enable security at all, then everyone can update that entity. And then you would go to the edit authorization to decide which user can perform the update on the entity. Resource permissions, that is what I mentioned, the specific use case here, because a resource permission is based on an OPSS class called the resource permission class, as shown in this screenshot. And it's indicating on the screenshot as well that this one is supposed to protect a menu. A menu by definition is not really an object, so it's more like a semantic thing, a logical thing that you want to protect. So I could define my own permission based on a resource permission, and you see I do this declaratively through the secure resource grants option, and then in the resource grant option I hit the green plus icon, and that would allow me to create a new permission class based on the resource permission. And I simply call this a menu security, and then I describe what it's for, and then for menu the action I defined to protect is invoke. What I can do then is I can define protected resources, and the protected resources then would define the target. Say I have a menu security option for shipment, then shipment would be my resource to protect with menu security. The expression language on the slide shows you how you can check security in your running application. So security context, user granted resource, and now menu security is the resource type, but then resource name is ship order menu item. So that's the target that I defined, and I define this as well declaratively, and the action I associate with that is view. So how can I further secure task flows? Now, one thing that you can do with bounded task flows, if they're not based on page fragments and use JSPX documents or JSF documents, you can configure task flow access restriction through its URL invoke property. By default, the setting is to calculated, which means that conditionally the task flow is accessible through a GET request coming from a browser. Now you can change this to a disallowed state, and the recommendation really is to have every bounded task flow not accessible from a GET request, because that would lock it down and that will further protect your environment. It's kind of a departmentalization where you lock down the individual modules that make up your application and then make sure that only the application flow is able to call it. So what else can you do? You can specify a servlet filter, just putting it up front the faces servlet. You can define facelessness, and in each of the phases of an operation you can check if the user is authenticated or authorized. You can define component validators to avoid SQL injection. I can have a regular expression validator that exists in the ADF faces component palette to check for SQL keywords and strings. In the queries, if you have a where clause, use bind variables, because that also protects you from SQL injection attacks. You can have pages, JSF documents and page fragments being moved under the web-inf directory, which makes them inaccessible from the browser side. Now you would think, okay, why do I need to do that? Because if the page is not accessed through the servlet that comes with Java Server Faces, there would be no action with the page anyway, so users wouldn't be able to do something. Well, at least they would be able to look at the page, and based on what you have in your page, they might get some information of how they can work around a specific functionality that might not be available to them yet. So they might understand the structure of the page and use JavaScript or whatever on the page to change the state of the page so that they are now enabled to do something you don't want them to do. So that's a good tip to give: move everything under the web-inf directory. You can use manage beans, view and entity implementation classes to check permissions. I mentioned that there are security expressions that you can use, but the ADF security context is also available through the ADF context, which is a statics class. So I can call ADF context get current, get security context, and then everything I showed you for the expression language I can do in Java as well. So I could encapsulate a method call in surrounding it in a either try catch block or just an if block and check security permission before I allow users to execute a specific part of my code. Always think defense in depth. Several layers of security really make it safe. Then you have OPS Ask credential APIs that help you to safely store username password pairs that you would need maybe for a service call. And don't forget RDBMS security, label security, or triggers that you implement on the database can make the application more secure and more protected. Always make sure that when you think of building security into ADF applications to not only peek at ADF security and the capabilities that I explained in here, because thinking out of the box, I think, is the best tool that an ADF or security-aware ADF application developer has. So views in a bounded task flow, for instance, don't require their own policy grants, and I made this statement during this session. However, nothing prevents you from declaratively protecting a page that resides within a task flow with a specific permission. And then you can use expression language or Java to check that permission. The only difference here is that it's never the framework automatically checking the permission, it's you in Java or expression language. So if I have a bounded task flow, and this bounded task flow has 2 pages for looking at vacation requests, one is the manager view and one is the employee view, then I can use the security permission to decide in a task flow router activity to which page I navigate the user. The only thing here is, because this is not centrally enforced by the system, you have to make sure that this security is consistently applied. So there should not be kind of a backdoor to get to the page. So you have to make sure that you're consistent with it. But thinking out of the box, yes, even though it's not required, you can use that functionality. Now let's see how you build security into an ADF application. To enable ADF security for your ADF application, you have 2 options. One is to go to the application menu, to the secure item, and then the configure ADF security menu item that will launch the security wizard. Another option is to click next to this icon, go to secure, and from here you also have configure ADF security as a menu item option. Now this launches the dialog for you to configure ADF security. The options you have are authentication authorization, just authentication only, and the ability to remove ADF security configuration, which doesn't mean that we delete any policy that you defined. All that we do is we unset the 2 flags that we have in the ADF config file to not require authorization or authentication, allowing you to test a protected application outside of the security context. The next step allows you to specify how the user should be authenticated. Basic authentication will launch the browser dialog. Client authentication requires a certificate to be available on the browser, or form-based authentication. This is what you commonly see, where application has a web form that uses a JUsername, JPassword, and JSecurity action to check user authentication with a server. In the sample that I wrote, I used programmatic authentication, and for this, and that is explained in the Fusion Middleware Developer Guide, for this I had to set it to basic authentication. So I'm working with proprietary APIs exposed on the WebLogic server to authenticate the user based on the username and password. In the next dialog, you specify how you want to have an existing application being handled and treated. If I select no automatic grants, then that means that all pages which are in an unbounded task flow are not accessible. They are locked down immediately. The same for bounded task flows. If I'm working in a team development environment or with a larger application that already exists, I want to avoid that everyone is kind of locked out of the application. So instead, what I want to do is I want to choose either grant to existing objects only or grant to all objects. If I choose grant to existing objects, then for the current state of the application, there will be a test all rule applied to all protected artifacts, pages, and task flows, and everyone is a member of this role, because this role is mapped to an anonymous user. So for the rest of my development team, when they further develop the application or test the application, there would be no indication that actually security is applied. If you choose grant to all objects, then for any new page, a new task flow being built, this test all rule will be applied as well. So if you choose grant to existing objects only, then any new page or task flow will be locked down, because it will wait for you as the security developer or administrator to assign an application rule to grant the permission, the access permission to it. This is the single access point I was talking about. So here you have the ability to tell if a user gets into your application, into some protected area, and gets redirected through the authentication servlet to perform authentication. Now, after successful authentication, where you want him or her to be redirected to. So a single point of access to the application for all authenticated users. If you don't set this option, as I do, then the way that the user accessed a restricted or protected resource will actually get him back exactly to that point. So in this case, you're not redirecting the user to somewhere else, but just to the resource that he or she was requesting. And finally, there's a summary of files that get changed. You see the JSON data XML file. The JSON data XML file is the policy store and the identity store at design time. By default, when you deploy your application, the content of the JSON data XML file will be deployed into system JSON data XML file on the WebLogic server instance that you deploy the application to, unless you defined the policy provider to be Oracle Internet Directory or RDBMS. The GPS config file you can ignore. This is for desktop applications. Here a similar file exists on the target server that you deploy to, and that would configure the policy store being used. Now with security enabled for my application, it's time to look into building test users and test roles, and also specifying some application roles to grant permissions to. And as I mentioned, this all is handled by the JSON data XML file, which is local to the application. To access the file, again I go to Application, Secure, and now I can choose what I want to do. If I want to build first the user, the groups, or the application roles, it all brings me to a visual representation of the JSON data XML file. Here you see from the top level tab we're actually talking to the JSON data XML file, and if I switch to the source view, you see that we're talking to an XML file, and that contains all the policies defined for this sample application. So this is nothing that you want to work with. Instead, you want to use the visual editor here. I have 3 users defined, and as I mentioned before, test users are not deployed to production servers. WebLogic server will throw an exception if you attempt doing so, just to avoid someone accidentally or by intention deploying a backdoor into a production server. So I have a username and password defined, and then the users are members of an enterprise group or an enterprise role. Now, enterprise groups and enterprise roles are considered to be global roles. So on an identity management, like in my case, Frank Nymphius is an Oracle employee, and somewhere in Oracle there is a security infrastructure that has an employee role, which is a global enterprise role, and I'm part of that. And this would allow me, for instance, to use VPN to get into the Oracle network as an Oracle employee. Similar, you build enterprise groups, which are global groups on your identity management system, and then users are members of those groups, and now these groups you would link to application roles which are specific to the application that you build. Because JDeveloper doesn't hook up to any identity management system at design time, you have to build or provision users and groups into the JSON data XML file before you can build and test ADF Security application. So similar, here I do have my enterprise groups created, and I can use this dialog to either add a user or add a role. And here are my application roles. You see by default we do have an anonymous role. The anonymous role is always there, and that is if you choose to have all existing objects, or in general all objects, being accessible, then this anonymous role will be used through the test user role with the policies that we generate into JSON data XML. So anonymous role means if there is an artifact, a page, or a bounded task flow that anyone if authenticated or not, should be able to access, then this is the role that you want to assign to that permission. Beside of that, I do have an application employee role, and you see that I have employees, managers, and HR managers all being part of the employee role. Then for the application HR manager role, I only have the HR manager group in it, and for the manager role, I have the enterprise manager group in it. So in here I can have a look at the grants that this application role has, but I'll show you how you specify the grants. So this is just for you to have an overview of what a specific application role is allowed to do, what permissions it has. If I wasn't in this editor and I wanted to work on specifying security roles, I could go to Application, Secure, and then choose Resource Grants or Entitlement Grants. And this would bring me to the same development environment as if I would click one of these links. So when I click to Resource Grants, I go to a view that shows for the application all the securable artifacts. So right now I don't have a source project selected. So if I choose a resource type, let's say task flows, then you see immediately for the view controller it would show all the protected artifacts. So I see bounded task flows here. There's no need to protect the unbounded task flow. In the unbounded task flow you would protect pages. So what we can see is I do have a browse employees bounded task flow that is linked to the application employee role, and the grant that we have is view. If I wanted to grant this browse employee bounded task flow to another application role, I can use the plus icon here and say add application role, add user, or add enterprise role. Typically you go for the least amount of effort, which typically is to grant to the application role and have later the security administrator on the target system mapping the enterprise group from the identity management store to the application. And for this they can use Enterprise Manager, which is another declarative environment that the security administrator has. Typically in the larger company the developer is not necessarily the same as the security administrator. So for that reason there's Enterprise Manager that allows you for deployed Oracle ADF application to map enterprise groups to application roles. So if I click application roles, I simply need to just click one of these roles and then I can give the permission to access the bounded task flow. Here also you see the test all role. So if I select the test all role, then this bounded task will be accessible to everyone, to all anonymous users as well. I'm not doing that. One thing that you want to make sure that if you use this, that at the end when you deploy your application, the test all role is completely removed from the permission grantings in your application. So I have a salaries overview, bounded task flow, and you see that for the salary overview, the HR manager and the manager role has view permission. I also have an option to show task flows that have the test all grants only assigned. So in my case, this resource area is empty, which indicates that all of my task flows have proper permission granting, which is good. And then I can say, okay, show all the task flows coming from an ADF library, which might be different from the task flows than you usually have in your application. And now you see I have 4 task flows here, and one comes from an ADF library, and that's the user profile bounded task flow. Yeah, and then whatever is in the library I can protect in the context of my application. I cannot use ADF security artifacts in a ADF library deployed task flow, so I have to first add the task flow to my application and then I can grant permission to it. Similar, I can grant permission to entity objects or entity attributes, and as you see nothing, and the reason is that the source project still sits set to view controller. So let's move the model layer to it, and then we see that we have entities protected for the application HR manager role, and what we can see is that employees for the delete are restricted to HR managers. So only HR managers can delete employees, which is fair enough, I think. You also see that if there are entities in an ADF library, I do have a checkbox that only shows entities that are coming from an ADF library, which I don't have any. Similar for entity attributes. Here we have employee commission and employee salary, and we see that the update of an attribute is only allowed for application HR managers, and that is what we saw at runtime already. One of the permissions I use on the panel tabs is a resource permission. A resource permission is a generic JAS permission file, so one that you don't have to build, that you simply configure. So in my configuration I do have a resource permission created panel tab protection, and this has one instance which is managers only. So for the panel tab protection resource that I created, I defined a protectable item as managers only. Now what I can do is now I can access this item and grant privileges or access privileges to it. And in expression language and in Java, I can check this particular panel tab protection for the manager only item if the authenticated user has the permission to do that. And this is what I used on the panel tabs to display or not display the tabs, or to make them read only. If you wanted to create your own resource type, so let's say you have resource protection, let's say sales resource protection, just as a name here, menu protection. The names could be different or they can even match, doesn't matter. What matters really is that here is a class which we put in by default, that is the resource permission. This is the object, the physical object that at runtime we check permissions again. And now I specify some actions. So for the sales menu, so I can place order as an action, and another action could be view. Maybe there are some people that are not allowed to even see the menu item. So this now creates a sales menu protection, but this is just the resource that I specified. Now what I need to do is I need to add resource items. So for here I go and say, okay, sales menu protection, and then the name of the item, that could be the sales menu item. So I call it sales menu item. And now for the sales menu item, I can grant this to an application rule, and I can say, for instance, all managers are allowed to place an order and to see that menu. And I can also say every employee is just allowed to see it, but not place an order. This way, with this resource permissions that you create, which are more semantic objects, so nothing that really physically exists as a Java class or as an XML file. So you have a menu structure. Those coming from Oracle Forms, for instance, they're used to have menu protection handled by Oracle Forms. Now a menu is nothing physical. It's something that belongs to the application, has more logical functionality, a kind of a navigation path to your application. And based on the navigation logic, you can specify resource protection. You can define resource permissions for specific menu infrastructures, and then for the menu items you create the resources, and then you grant the resources to specific roles in your application, and you decide what type of action is the user allowed: view, place order, perform actions, ship products, and so on and so on. In expression language on the view layer and on the controller layer, or in Java on a view layer, on the controller layer, you are able to check that permission, and based on the result and the outcome of the check permission, you then decide whether or not to give access to the user. Now, what I also mentioned is that when I talked about entitlements, I said it has nothing to do with entitlement server, but it's a way to simplify administration. Now you can imagine this is a very simple application that I built, and already for that simple application I have quite some resources defined that require permission. Now on a bigger application, I may end up with thousands of artifacts that needs permissions, and some of these artifacts require the same permission. So instead of going to each of these artifacts individually, I can group them, and that is what we call an entitlement. So here I do have a grouping called public task flows, and for this public task flows I assigned the browse employees bounded task flow and the user profile bounded task flow, because these are my public accessible bounded task flow, and I granted the view action. Customize, grant and personalize are not used by Oracle IDF. They are coming from Web Center. So in Web Center, the framework will check these actions as well. ADF, the framework, will only check for views. If I wanted to change my entitlements or just create a new entitlement, I could just press the plus icon here, my new entitlement. It's just a group name here. Some description would be good, but not necessarily required. And then I can add resources to this entitlement. So maybe I want to have entity resources. I could say, okay, everyone should be allowed to access the employees entity, and everyone should be allowed to delete, maybe. Yeah, or I can just say, okay, add to the same grant the panel tab protection. So I'm now adding more and more protectable resources to this entitlement, and then with this one grant of this entitlement, so I specify resources, artifacts and actions on these artifacts to this entitlement. And now you see currently it's locked because there's no one really allowed to use that entitlement. If I go to grants here, I can now go and select managers, for instance, and now I have a group of artifacts assigned to managers, simplifying my administration task. That's all that's about to say about this JSON data XML visual editing that we provide within Oracle JDeveloper. The next step is to have a look at how you use expression language on a view layer to enforce security which is not enforced by the framework. So let's have a look how you can use expression language in ADF Faces to check the security context of ADF Security for resource permissions. Just remember, resource permissions is what you build to protect, for instance, menu items. Now in my case here I have a panel tab layout, and the panel tab I have secured with expression language. Let's go to the HR Managers Only tab, which I showed you at runtime. So when I go to the property inspector, you see the first property setting, which is called rendered, and this rendered setting points to a granted resource with the resource name Managers Only, and the resource type is a panel tab protection, which I showed you in the JSON data XML file, and the action is view. So if the user is allowed to view this panel tab, that is the normal manager and the HR manager, then this panel tab will be rendered as runtime. And then there is another setting which is disabled, and here I do have just the same protection type, resource type, panel tab protection for managers only, and now the action is open, and only HR managers are allowed to open that panel tab. So I have a resource permission defined in the JSON data XML file, which I simply made up because of my application needs, and now in expression language I can check that. On the same way, I could have a managed bean, and if the managed bean was to toggle the tab, maybe programmatically switching the panel tabs, I can wrap the code that's doing that into a check permission, and then in Java I can already check if the user has the right permission. So let's open up the expression language builder. So we do this by clicking on this down arrow icon. This is the complete string, and then when I extend the ADF bindings security context area, these are all the expression language strings I have available to use within my application development to check security. And remember, the framework only enforces security on pages in unbounded task flows and on bounded task flows. So everything else, if it's a router, if it's a method activity, if it's on the page, a component like a panel tab, I enforce it myself in my application using expression language or Java. So when I click region viewable, don't know how to use that, I can expand the description tag here, and then it gives me an idea of what the expression language string has to look like. And the target in the page case is to point to the page definition file of the page. So let's close that one and move on to how we use the security context on ADF business components. As I mentioned before, the best integration that we have in ADF with the ADF security context is if the model is business services, because if ADF business components is used as a business service, then we do have an integration to the same security context. And if I go to entities, employees, I have an employees impl file here, which extends the framework, and here I overrode the isAttributeUpdatable method. Now, isAttributeUpdatable is called internally by the framework whenever a page renders, and it tells the component to render in read-only mode or in editable mode. One of the policies I enforced in this code is that a manager is allowed to change salary for employees that are newly created. So if you start creating a new employee reporting to you, then you can edit the salary. As soon as you submit and then commit the new employee, then only HR managers are allowed to change the salary. So for this, I overrode the isAttributeUpdatable method. What we see here is that I created a resource permission, and this resource permission has a type of insert entity attribute. So that's the resource permission. The entity name, so the protectable item, is the name of the entity, and I have the same configuration in the JSON data XML file as I showed you before. And then there's an action with it, which is insert. And in Java now I can access the security context which is coming from ADF, and I've built a resource permission. I say new resource permission, type entity name and action, so insert. And if the user has this permission, security context has permission, and pass in the instance of this permission that I want to check for, I allow the user to edit the salary on insert. Now this one is the permission that every manager has. Now HR managers don't need to bother, because if you're an HR manager you have the permission anyway, because the permission for updating the employee is defined on the entity. And this is what I'll show you next. So this is just the programmatic way of doing that. If I double click on the employee entity, then I have a security setting here, security employees, and here I see that remove current row is enabled. So that means that remove current row is protected on the entity level, which means that the framework checks before a delete operation happens if the user is allowed to do that. What it doesn't do is it does not prevent the commit operation to happen on the client side. So if you want to have the button invoking the commit operation or the remove operation to be disabled, that is something you do in expression language. This just on the business service enforces the security rule. And then what I can do also, I can go to attributes, and here on the salary tab I also have security. And for those that are not familiar with this user interface here, I'm running 11G release 2. So this looks slightly different on 11G release 1, but the functionality security wise is all the same. Here for the salary attribute, I enforce that the update privilege needs to be security checked. So selecting this employee here, go to salary in the structure window, and there's an edit authorization option. And this brings me exactly to the same editor, to the JSON data XML editor, and now I can see employee salary is granted as an update privilege to HR managers. But remember my setting here in the impl Java file, because here I override the security setting. By default, security says that only HR managers are allowed to update the salary. But here I override this setting and say, okay, if you do have the insert entity attribute permission for the salary, then if the employee is new, you're allowed to put in salary as well. So you see, it's a very flexible security architecture that we have in ADF, and it allows you as a developer, even without understanding the ins and outs of JAS, to protect your application easily and declarative in most of the parts. So what's next? You can follow the Oracle JDeveloper and ADF community more closely using Twitter, Facebook, or Oracle JDeveloper PM blog. In addition, the Oracle JDeveloper homepage is on the OTN Technology Network, and you find it in oracle.com/technetwork/jdev. There we provide a lot of tutorials that get you started and even further with Oracle ADF development. We provide demos, the software of course for download, access to the discussion forum where you can ask a question and get them answered by experts, references to blogs that are written about ADF, and a lot more information.